Welcome. I'm Tita Chico, Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. We convened this year-long series on anti-racism to act on the various statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter issued by the department, the college, and university. Anti-racism is not an add-on in this series. It is the intellectual starting point for humanistic literary inquiry and knowledge production. Anti-racism is a concept with a history, a politics, and an aesthetics. Anti-racism is also a practice to push us beyond the inadequacy of diversity and inclusion. As my colleague, Professor Zita Nunez writes, this is not the time, if ever there was such a time, for shifting over a bit to make room, for being the one to allow others to speak, for making promises. This is the time for remaking, for asking who we are. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter. Jacob Blake, Black Lives Matter. We are meeting virtually today, but we are grounded by our institutional home, the University of Maryland. With this series, we honor and celebrate the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young Black man who was about to graduate when he was murdered in 2017 by a white supremacist at a campus bus stop. Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, Black Lives Matter. We're meeting virtually today, but we are also grounded by the sedimented lands upon which the university stands. The grounds of the university are on what is now known as the state of Maryland, adjacent to the District of Columbia, the seat of the US federal government. But these grounds are the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. For the indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather, to evoke the phrasing of Professor Gina Zuroski, the long 18th century has never ended. Our area is home to a football team named, until very recently, with a racial slur. The University of Maryland was built through wealth extracted from enslaved Black men, women, and children. The first trustees were slavocrats. 80 years later, Thurgood Marshall was refused admission to the law school. But historical records also demand that we bring to them what Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation. The 1850 and 1860 census documents 12 members of the Adams family and probably some enslaved kin in 4 households adjacent to campus. And Adam Francis Plummer, an enslaved Black man, owned by the founder of Maryland, Charles Benedict Calvert. Adam Francis Plummer, he left us his diary. What were their interior lives? How can anti-racism challenge us to understand the past and the present? How can anti-racism help us to imagine and make a better future? How can anti-racism enable us to remake who we are? Today, we are very honored to welcome Eugenia Zuroski and Aisha Wilks, who will talk about anti-racist pedagogies. Financial support for our gathering today is provided by the Stringer Foundation. With it, we are also able to commit to making these events accessible. Live captioning is available through the Typewell window, and I've included that link in the chat. For those of you on Twitter, our hashtags for conversation are hashtag antiracismUMD and hashtag CLCSUMD_UMD. And please take a look at the events we have planned for the year on our webpage. Finally, I want to offer a very special thanks to Dr. Karen Nelson, co-director of the center and director of research for the English department. Our program will be 1 hour. Our guests will be in conversation with each other for about 30 minutes, after which my colleague Lee Constantino and I will come back to moderate the Q&A. And we ask that you pose your questions in the Q&A function. Now, would you please join me in welcoming Gina Zuroski and Aisha Wilks for Where Do You Know From? Anti-Racist Pedagogies. Thank you. So if Gina and Aisha would turn on your cameras.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Great to see, well, not to see you, but great to have you here.
To know that you're there. So Aisha and I, one thing that we have in common is that we are chronic over preparers. And so we tried very, very hard not to prepare too much to keep this as conversational as possible. But one thing we did decide we would do is we would introduce ourselves by responding to the question, where do you know from? So I'll go first, if that's all right with you, Aisha, and then
Please.
I know from, and I'm speaking to all of you today from my home, which is in Dish with One Spoon territory, the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. I wanted to start today by acknowledging that where I'm speaking from is close to the site on which Haudenosaunee land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane are currently standing against a housing development on Six Nations land. And the ongoing movements and stances and activism against colonization and the reproduction and the ongoing expansion and intensification of settler colonization where I am and where I'm thinking from these days, I try to keep at the forefront of everything I try to know about. So that's where I wanted to start. For me personally, I would say that I know from a series of in-between positions. I'm a US citizen. I'm also a permanent resident in Canada. And I've been living in what's currently known as Canada for 11 years. I'm currently cut off from my family by pandemic conditions, which is awful. But I'm well, and my partner and my child are all healthy, so I'm grateful for that. I am the descendant of Chinese, Italian, and Polish immigrants to the United States in the early 20th century. And this places me within settler cultures here, but it also places me outside of whiteness. And so I have been learning my whole life, and then more recently, kind of learning in more deliberate ways to live and think in ways that resist perpetuating settlement, even as I'm kind of complicit in or involved in settler culture here. And I've been doing this over the last few years, particularly by learning from Indigenous and Black knowledge communities in the region where I live and beyond. So I'm here today because I think that anti-racist ways of knowing are part of this commitment to learn how to live and think and know in ways that resist settlement. And I wanted to emphasize that I come here to speak on this topic, not as an expert by any means. I think this is something that I don't know if one can have expertise in this area. But I certainly don't. If anyone does, it's not me. I come as a learner and as a learning practitioner. And as a teacher, I feel an obligation to channel what I learn on this front and to generate new knowledge through processes of thinking with others, but not to lay claim to any particular ideas or methods, which is how academic expertise generally or traditionally kind of asserts itself and reproduces itself. So I'm not here as a leader. I'm just trying to put myself in the middle of collective thinking and action. And I'm very grateful to be here in the middle of all of you today.
Thanks, Gina. So in terms of where I know from, like Gina, I am located in close proximity, at least, to Hamilton, lands governed by the Upper Canada Treaties and adjacent to lands covered by the Haldimand Treaty. And likewise, I have been attentive to and thinking with the land defenders at 1492 Land Back Lane as they work against settler colonial incursions. I've been thinking too about the ways that our digital networks allow us to move across and through this colonial border that nonetheless separates us. And thinking about the Piscataway and the Annisquadan people in Baltimore, as well as the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people who have been the stewards of the land on which I reside here in Toronto, as well as the Huron-Wendat, but also the lands where I've learned, thinking through as well the ways that I've learned in Tyendinaga territory when I attended Queen's University, and the ways that that experience was conditioned by whiteness and by settler colonialism, even within that context. So when I think about where I know from, it's inextricable from these relations that are a constant reminder of my own commitments to the land, but also of the conditions that my grandmother left when she came to Canada from Jamaica, that make me a first-generation Canadian, and yet which separate me in so many ways from Canada as a project. And in many ways too from the position of settler. So navigating my own relationship and my responsibilities within that context, knowing that the only home I have to return to is one that was taken from brutally genocided Arawaks and Carib peoples, is something that I try to navigate in my own work on Blackness and Madness. But when I think about where I know from, I can't think simply of physical space or even of relations as much as the possibilities and expansiveness of Blackness have taught me in terms of care, in terms of possibility, but also thinking about my body as a place from which I know, and my body mind as a place from which I know, because I have a mental health disability, and that has taught me a great deal. I'm always reluctant to use the framework of learning from my disability, because I think that that suggests that it exists purely for utility, but I also have to acknowledge that it's taught me different ways of relating to time and space, and of relating to myself as well, and the work that I produce, because I have to be so much more deliberate about it, and I have to do so much to train myself into certain ways of being, and train myself out of them as well, in order to be the type of learner and the type of teacher that I want to be. And so engaging with disability justice communities for me has been an essential part of learning and knowing. And I've been able to come to those communities through a body mind that has been impacted so much by racial trauma, but also that is renewed in a lot of ways through the communities that I have found. And so I'm thinking about all the many ways I know, and I'm grateful for this question precisely for that reason, because it allows us to think beyond a geographical understanding of where, to thinking through the relationships that are crafted through those places, and also crafted through our embodied interaction and engagement with those places. So that is my introduction.
So we have, Aisha and I kind of prepared some questions for each other as a way of structuring our conversation. But I just wanted to mention, you know, how she and I kind of came together, where our own relationship, which is ongoing, started. It was a really happy accident. Well, it was happy for me. I don't want to speak for Aisha, but last year, was it only last year or 2 years ago? Anyway, sometime either last year or the year previous. Time is you know, more meaningless than ever for me these days. I was teaching a graduate seminar at our home institution of McMaster on the secret life of things in the 18th century, which is, it was a literary and cultural studies class that, you know, we read 18th century fiction and we talked about, you know, things. And Aisha enrolled in the class and we'd never met before and we didn't know each other. And she revealed on the first day, which I don't remember if we used this exercise, if I had developed it yet, but I remember during first day introduction, she said, well, I was enrolled in another seminar that was canceled and this was like the only thing left. And so here I am. And I felt so bad that someone had ended up at, you know, unwittingly in an 18th century literature class. But I learned so much from her in the course of doing that class together. And it really, I kind of came out of that semester with a new focus, a new sense of what's possible in the teaching of 18th century literature. And I said to myself, if I ever teach that class again, I'm going to do it quite differently. So that was an important meeting for me. And I wanted to have this conversation specifically with Aisha because we have this relationship that's framed by pedagogy, but that I think, you know, also highlights what's possible within the pedagogical arrangements of our departments and our programs that the departments and programs might not necessarily have in mind, you know, like the way that we can come together and that pedagogy leaves room for fortuitous slippages that new relations can emerge out of. But if it's okay with you, Aisha, I wanted to start by asking you a question. Can we start there?
Yeah, let's do
it. And I'm
it.
going to ask you the big one.
Oh.
I think it's the important one. And I myself am, you know, I need to know your answer to this question. And my question is, you know, we're here to talk about anti-racist pedagogy. And so my starting question is, do you think that anti-racist pedagogy exists? And have you ever experienced it? And, you know, if it doesn't quite exist, do you think it's possible? Like, you know, what's the status of this thing or this practice or this idea that we're calling anti-racist pedagogy? And what is your experience of pedagogy in terms of anti-racist thinking and practice?
It's a big one. No lies were told. So, I mean, my short answer to the question is I don't know. So we can just pack up and go. But my longer answer to that question is, I think obviously I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that some version of anti-racist pedagogy is possible, or at least that we could do better than we have done, broadly speaking. But I think that there are serious questions that we need to ask ourselves about anti-racist pedagogy. And some of those questions include, you know, who is your pedagogy for? Where does it go? How did you arrive at it? And are you thinking when you're crafting your pedagogy, when you're developing a syllabus, when you're walking into the classroom, of the safety of your students, or are you thinking of their comfort? And whose comfort or safety? And for me, all of those questions are important because when we talk about anti-racism, we're talking specifically in an oppositional mode. I think, and people have critiqued anti-racism precisely from that lens, that because we're moving or working in an oppositional mode, we are necessarily centering an experience of racism and of racial violence that's predicated, right, on whiteness and the presence of whiteness in our classrooms and of white supremacy as well. But I think too that the oppositional mode can give us as much as it forecloses for us. And insofar as we're working in an oppositional mode, we need to think about what we're in opposition to and how we can be in opposition to those things when they structure every aspect of the student's experience and often of the professors or instructors as well. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you're teaching a racist text, are you in opposition to that text? Do you love the text that you're in opposition to? And how do you reconcile those two positions? You know, are you teaching in opposition to your institution, in opposition to your possibilities of promotion, of prestige, of reputation? I think sometimes we have to get out of our own ways in order to engage in anti-racist pedagogy. And I think that there are relatively few people who have committed seriously to doing that. I don't think an anti-racist classroom is a harm-free classroom, because I recognize there's no possibility of eliminating harm. No matter how good the instructor, no matter how careful or thoughtful they are, no matter how well they prepare for those inevitable moments in the semester when a student will get in their feelings or you know, make an insensitive comment, racist or otherwise, I think regardless of all those things, it is really important to know that's harmlessness is not possible. But an anti-racist classroom is doing everything in its power, is setting up as many conditions as possible to make racism unwelcome there. And I think I have been in anti-racist classrooms or experienced anti-racist pedagogy. However, I have also seen the moments when it breaks down. I have seen that happen through no fault of the professors. I've seen that happen because instructors were attacked, and particularly instructors of color, by their own students in the classroom. I have seen it break down because of the instructor themselves, right? And their inability to see beyond the framework in which they're operating. So in some cases, that framework is whiteness. In some cases, it's a particular theory or set of theories. And I think that there are a number of preconditions to an anti-racist classroom. I mean, one of them would probably be the complete reform of K-12 education. But speaking somewhat more realistically, I'm talking about what happens outside the classroom, right? I have been pursued to my office and had a colleague repeat the N-word to me several times in the course of conversation. And that's a function of discussions of race within the classroom that I consider to be extremely important, but which nonetheless are very difficult in that when it triggers that much vaunted term, white fragility, right? It's very, very hard for students of color to escape that. And likewise, if the entire institution and the structure of a department is set up in ways that exclude racialized students, that exclude or that put undue burdens on BIPOC scholars, that is likewise going to make the anti-racist pedagogy in the classroom, I don't want to say less meaningful, but it limits the possibilities of that type of engagement, and it affects the way that students are coming to the space. If they're coming to the space having been harmed at every other point, then it's going to be a very different dynamic and a much more fraught dynamic. So I think that if you are committed to anti-racist pedagogy, you cannot simply think about your syllabus. You also have to think about the structure of your department, the structure of your institution, and what you are doing to actually change and challenge and transform those structures so that they can welcome and hold students of all kinds. And so that, for me, is what would be required in order for anti-racism to work. And I'm indebted in my thinking to Maori scholar Alice Te Punga Somerville, to Nadine Atwell, who is a scholar in Gina, in the department Gina and I share, of Asian North America, and to so many thinkers, Gina included, in terms of how I conceptualize anti-racist pedagogy, but also how I conceptualize the institution as a site from which we are, as Fred Moten would put it, kind of always seeking fugitivity, always seeking to steal and return those resources to those who need it most. And I think, I hope that in working towards anti-racist pedagogy, people are thinking about the students who most need it, who most need them to think about accessibility, which is both a disability and a racial justice issue, who most need them to be thinking about the content that they're teaching.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very full and thoughtful answer to my very large question. And now you can ask me a question.
Mine isn't quite as big, I hope.
Me too.
But it's two. I think my question is two-pronged. So my question is, in part about the where do we know from exercise. So my question is thinking partially about the limitations of the exercise, but also thinking about the ways that students come to that exercise. Because I know that as a Black student, I have heard the question, where are you from, so many times, and they never mean Toronto. And so hearing where do you know from, I think, is a different experience than for those people for whom the question, where are you from, is not a daily part of their lives and their interactions with people, the small talk that grease the wheels of our social functions. And so thinking about this exercise and about the possibilities that it brings into the classroom, I think I'm wondering both about the kinds of responses that you receive to it, but also the way that those responses may or may not reveal the limitations of the exercise. And I guess we can link that to anti-racist pedagogy or whatever.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'll try. So every time that I've used this exercise so far, and I'll repeat, I won't go into detail because it's in, like, I give an account of this in the handout that I give out in class, as well as in the article that came out in MAI, I'm actually not sure how they pronounce their name, but the online journal that published it with a short introduction that also gives an account of where it's from, where the exercise knows from. This was inspired by a panel discussion that I heard at OISE at a day-long symposium on teaching Indigenous graduate students. So for instructors who teach Indigenous students, it was like a symposium on, pedagogies and pedagogical practices that need to be cultivated in order to create kind of safe and equitable learning environments for Indigenous students. And so one of the panelists, Mattel Matani, was talking about how she learned from Catherine McKittrick to ask, instead of the question, where are you from, which is like the typical icebreaker, where do you know from, which is a slightly different question. But the way in which the question's different is complicated and it's not immediately apparent, right? And so I developed this exercise first as a way of, for me, of thinking about what the question, where do you know from, is asking, and what it potentially brings into the classroom that's different or kind of situated kind of somewhat differently than the normal icebreaker questions that we tend to use to open courses. And opening courses that first day when you go around the room and everyone introduces themselves, especially in seminars, and I've only ever used this exercise in seminar classes, it's also it's also the beginning of establishing all the relationships, that kind of take shape in the room over the semester or the term. So it was, a way for me to reflect first. And then every time that I've done it with students, I've kind of learned more about what the question does with a group of people who know from very different, sites. and positions. And one of the things I think is interesting is that most people tend to answer the question, where do you know from, with something very similar to, I imagine, what they would say if you ask them where they are from, but adding, but adding more, right? So we get a lot of, I grew up here, this is my ethnicity, this is my community, you kind of get all of the biographical touch points or information that the individual thinks is important for understanding who they are. And that's, that works really beautifully. I mean, I think that you learn a lot about each other, and that's valuable. But I also think that the question is meant to prompt the possibility of recognizing that you know from somewhere other than identity. It's a question that doesn't have to be answered in terms of identity. And because we're so steeped in, like an ongoing 18th century culture of liberal individualism, where identity is positioned as the seat of personhood, right? I think it's a challenge to imagine your knowledge as not just a kind of expression of identity, but as something that comes from elsewhere. And so some of the conversations that the exercise has prompted have turned to, like, it has occasionally allowed for a nice segue into a conversation about knowledge as a collective phenomenon and not just an individual phenomenon. And for us to talk about what the conditions would have to be in this classroom for us to know things together, right? For us to think with one another, and eventually to be able to say, we know from this room together in some way. But this is a relationship that's just getting off the ground, right? Like, we all just arrived here. So we have to work out the terms of engagement and relationship in order to think about each of us being able to know from this place in a way that we consider valuable to us, and coming and nurturing to us, right? Not extractive, not painful, because, harm is being done in the extraction of knowledge, but knowing together as a kind of collective, a true collective practice. So, that never happens perfectly, but that was one of my hopes. But to return to your question about the way that people inevitably come to the exercise because they're coming from different sites of knowledge and positions, and that includes, a certain conditioning of suspicion, I think, which is, I think absolutely right. I think you have certain students who, as a result of that accrued experience of racism, for example, in all the spaces of academia, they come to every single seminar table, and I should say we, because I to some extent I share this experience. We come to the seminar table with certain boundaries, well cultivated, and a certain level of suspicion about all pedagogical practices that happen within our departments, within the university. And especially when you don't know everyone around the table and you don't know the professor, I think we should all be suspicious, because pedagogy in the university is a practice of power differentiation. It's like there's no pedagogy without power being exercised, right? And so the students in the classroom, I think students should always be suspicious of the person who introduces themselves as somehow in charge of the class and the classroom. At the same time, I think the instructor has a certain responsibility, which you might say is a way of being in charge. So it's not like the professor can just walk into the room and say, I'm just one of you, we're all equal here. That's not, you can't disavow the authority vested in you as the leader of the pedagogical experience in that room. So I I wanted to make an exercise, and I tried to, do the exercise in a way that allows students to resist it if they feel resistant to it. And this is really tricky, because I think this is how I'm going to link this to anti-racist pedagogy. I think anti-racist pedagogy has to make a really firm commitment to resisting mastery in the way that it's practiced. And that goes against the grain of how I was trained as a university instructor, and all the examples of pedagogy that I saw, through my own education, where mastery is, connected to expertise, is connected to the authority of an instructor in a classroom. And so to resist mastery is a way of confusing things in a certain way that can be both very generative and also very confusing for everyone in the space. And I've been reading through Julietta Singh's book, Unthinking Mastery. So I just wanted to give like a citation to that, because I think that's a great place to, think through some of these practices. But for me, one of the aspects of resisting mastery in the classroom is to make the classroom a space where resistance is always possible for students. And so that means, on the one hand, that students have to know that they will not be punished for resisting anything really in the classroom, except for, again, this is like within the conditions of racism is not welcome here, right? Like if you resist the anti-racism in the room, then further conversations need to be had. But in terms of resisting what I'm teaching, right? Like resisting assignments, resisting things I say, in the course of explaining something, resisting the syllabus, what's on it and what's not on it. I think students need to know that they are allowed, in this room at least, to voice their resistance to any of this. And that means if I give you an assignment and it says, brainstorm where you know from and then have a conversation with your partner, and some part of this strikes you wrong, or there's just something in you that says, I don't know, I don't want to do this, you will not be punished for that, for not doing it, right? At the same time, and this is why it's tricky, for resistance to be possible in the classroom, you cannot design the class in such an open and generous way that you've already co-opted the sites of resistance from students, right? So if I were to say, I'm handing you all this piece of paper and it has these prompts on it and it tells you to do things, and the assignment is, do them or don't do them, answer the questions or don't answer the questions, write a paragraph about where you know from, or, do an interpretive dance. Like if you tell them that the assignment is to do anything, you've kind of co-opted the sites of resistance for your pedagogy, so I feel like part of my job as instructor is to own the power and the authority that's vested in me institutionally, to be honest and forthcoming about that, not to disavow it, right? Not to say, I'm not in charge here, I am in charge here, I get to give everyone grades. Even if I say I'm not gonna grade people, I can if I want to, right? So not to disavow my own position, and to give assignments that have boundaries, that have expectations, but that let students know that they can safely resist those boundaries or situate themselves to the side of them or on the outside of them without fearing reprisal, that I'm going to fail them or they're going to be kicked out of the university. And that's a tricky thing to do, but I think that's where I would situate this exercise and what I'm trying to do in class in general. And so the students who come to things like this with experiences that make them like side-eye it, they're really important because they're helping me see where the, as you put it, like where the limits are. So I know how to frame those limits and make them apparent, but without, you know, without disavowing them.
Thank you so much, Aisha and Gina, for your conversation. We have a few questions coming through. I know I have about 790 questions, but I will defer, and Lee's gonna jump in as well. And so if attendees, if you could please post your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them. We will, following this, when this is uploaded to YouTube, we'll have a kind of discussion of what the questions were, and including those that aren't addressed. Okay, Aisha, this is a question. I would love to hear more about how you understand the difference between safety and comfort, because this seems vital. And how would you say that both are raced and gendered? And I have to say, I was absolutely stunned and really moved by that distinction that you make. Yeah.
Thank you. Safety and comfort. I'm sort of like, well, I think about safety in terms of what are the conditions that are required in order for you to feel as if you can bring yourself into the room without having some essential part of you attacked in some way. And I think comfort I think comfort is often around what we want, about our ideal set of circumstances, the circumstances that would leave us unbothered. And comfort is not unimportant, but I think that if we're going to sacrifice safety for someone's comfort, then that's a problem. Because I can't say in how many different circumstances I have been made to feel like spaces are not safe. And I don't simply mean that those spaces, that I don't like being in those spaces, or I feel a little niggle when I'm there, but I feel as if those spaces are actively hostile. It's a moment when I recognize that the people in those spaces do not have the same value for my identity or for my life as I do for theirs. And for me, that moment is, it's incredibly confronting, but it also makes it very difficult to feel as if I can return to those spaces. And yet I'm going to be asked to do so again and again. So more specific examples might be, if I know that a racial slur will be tolerated in a classroom, that's a very obvious one. But likewise, if I know that professors don't really take disability seriously, or if they say things like, you know, I just think it's very important that everyone does this normative thing that is very difficult. As if it should be really easy, if they frame it as a matter of respect and don't leave room for other possibilities. Those are things that can compromise a student's sense of safety, because how does one show up as one's whole self in those moments? And I think, you know, if your whole self is racist, it's okay to me that you don't feel comfortable sharing that. It's probably even okay if you don't feel safe sharing that, in the sense that you feel as if there will be consequences to that action in the form of, you know, a call in or a call out, for instance. But I think that we should always want people to feel as if they can show up to the classroom without the threat of harm. Because you can change racist behavior. You can't change your race. You can't change you can't change your sexual orientation, right? You can't change your gender. Those things may be fluid, but those changes don't come from outside, and they can't come in response to people's feedback or hatred. So for me, that's kind of the separation that I would be inclined to make between safety and comfort.
Can I just add one quick thing to that, which I think is something that I've come to understand with more clarity than ever over the last few years, especially as the term, white fragility has entered the discourse. And I think one of the challenges, not just of teaching, but of all anti-racist work, is that white communities often do not experience a difference between discomfort and harm. And so, one of the things that you end up teaching, and you have to, and this is a kind of teaching that requires a much different approach than like, I made a PowerPoint, let's walk through this. It's a kind of, constant engagement with people in groups, as individuals, modeling, providing vocabulary. It's a kind of mentoring, more than instruction. But I think that white students need, not all of them, but many of them need really intensive mentoring and coaching in understanding how BIPOC communities understand and experience this distinction between harm and discomfort. And that's because these are people coming from positions in which comfort is not a baseline norm, like people of color, BIPOC people are not comfortable under white supremacy. But the people who are often feel the moment that they're made uncomfortable, that they are being harmed. And so that's, that's a constant challenge and a responsibility that we need to take up as instructors.
Thank you. And there are a bunch of questions coming in. There's one that just came in kind of pulling up on this, and then we'll move to a slightly different kind of vector. But it's, a questioner asked, could you speak to the exhaustion or personal jeopardy that BIPOC students or instructors can sometimes feel when they feel compelled or obligated to discuss issues of race, and how to reckon with this, how to make that not be? Yeah.
I'll try to offer a kind of quick answer, although this is not a question that can be answered quickly, which is, I think that it is important to recognize that anti-racist pedagogy does not mean teaching race constantly. Meaning, it doesn't mean, putting on the table, putting on the agenda, something that problematizes racism overtly, strongly, right? It means not shying away from material that does that. But I think I'm going to go back to the course that that Aisha took with me on The Secret Life of Things in 18th Century Literature, which was not a course I organized around race and racism primarily. I think if I taught it again, I would do more of that work. I would make it more focused on that. But it was a course about subjectivity, objectivity, and early capitalism in 18th century England. So, race and gender are ever present, dynamics and issues within that context. And so I tried to teach it in a way where I let these texts kind of raise the questions for us, and I tried to create space for students to be able to recognize how, issues of race, racism, misogyny, whatever, how they come out of the text. But I think that having a syllabus that allows all students to kind of engage with, something like to bring them there to say, we're going to read this 18th century novel and think about why it has talking things in it, or we're going to read, Aisha wrote this brilliant paper about Pompey the Little, right? So like to bring people to the table and say, we're going to read this 18th century novel about a lapdog. I think, kind of sometimes gets away from the exhaustion of knowing that like every class you go to, it's like, okay, we're going to go battle race again. Like, we're going to go battle racism again. So it's not that it's not there, but that it emerges organically out of people's being allowed to study and think about something else. And also to never foreclose the possibility of talking about, joy and pleasure attached to racialized communities, right? Rather than thinking that anti-racist teaching means we constantly have to talk about white supremacy, right? That's actually not anti-racist. That's recentering whiteness.
So there, thank you. And you should, I don't want to, did you want to say?
Oh, no, please go ahead. That was a wonderful answer.
Okay. So kind of building on that, there are a number of questions about kind of the praxis of this. And a commenter alludes to a common friend, Manu, who tweeted, I think Manu Chander tweeted recently about the syllabus being the start of the negotiation. And so some questions about, is to think about resistance, and is pushing back the same thing, negotiation, are these tools that you would kind of imagine being part of an anti-racist pedagogy? And then I'm using my, because I can be here, I want to ask the question about mastery, individualism, and graduate training, I think is massive, right? How does one, so that we may not have time for that, but just in terms of the syllabus and kind of on the ground, in the moment, and do you return to this exercise through the course of the semester and things like that?
Aisha, do you want to start or do you want me to?
I can. I mean, I think that I often think of the syllabus as a site of negotiation, partially because the syllabus will account not only for the materials under discussion, but also for the course policies. And so I think that in those early classes discussing the syllabus, that can be an opportunity for negotiation. And I think being very frank and upfront about that can be really productive and useful. And I also think about syllabus negotiation as a syllabus development as a negotiation between oneself and the texts under discussion, right? I think when you're creating a syllabus, that's one of the things that you're thinking about and working with. You're thinking about your own relationship to the materials, how they relate to one another, and so forth. And then ultimately, when you present those syllabi or the syllabus to the class, I think they are likewise engaged in a certain form of negotiation. That's really, and I think that that's a potential site of resistance. I think pushback is another potential site of resistance. And I think that sometimes in pushing back, I've seen instructors develop new policies. So I was in a class one year that had several challenges. And the following year, I was in another class with the same instructor, and she reminded students that not all learning has to take place in the classroom, that some students may come to the course with less knowledge about a particular area, but that some questions don't need to be posed within the context of the classroom, and that she would signal the questions that ought be brought to office hours, for example. And I think that that's likewise a way that an instructor can discourage the assumption that the seminar is the space for mastery too. Like, I think that often we think that the seminar is the place where we're going to hash it out, where we're going to understand, where we are going to either comply or make the instructor compliant to our imagining. However, I think that there's room always to push back on that assumption. And I think that that was one of the concrete ways that I saw someone push back against that assumption.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I want to add about the syllabus that one of the ways that I've experienced and approached syllabus making as the beginning of the negotiation is to think about the syllabus as an opportunity to reframe texts that there is a kind of established body of knowledge about that are canonical, right? So they're expected to be on the syllabus. I mean, I think when people talk about, you know, decolonizing the syllabus, it means so many different things, and not everyone is even convinced that, you know, a syllabus is a site where decolonization can happen. Again, it's still within the university, which is not a decolonized space. But I think that a lot of times the first instinct is to replace all the primary texts, you know, like all the lists of, you know, dead white men and a few women, right, with just like all new names. But I actually think that, you know, syllabus building has to be a chance to rethink the syllabus's relationship to canonicity, rather than be a site where we just make new canons. And one of the ways that we can do that is to, like practically, one of the things that I've done in building my 18th century literature syllabi is not just to jettison all of the texts as they've become more problematic, you know, to me. I'm thinking about Aisha's question, like, you know, what is your relationship to this racist text? Do you love it? I mean, that's a really difficult and uncomfortable question for a lot of us trained in 18th century literature, because it's all racist and we do love so much of it, right? And that's why we have devoted so much time and energy to it. But, you know, I think that it's a meaningful change to teach you know, I mean, just for example, right, like a Jane Austen novel, and have the secondary reading be by you know, critics of color, right? To read the novel, but also to use the syllabus and its kind of conventional ways of authorizing voices as meaningful sites of knowledge about something, to introduce experts, you know, as relevant to reading a Jane Austen novel that you might not have, that 18th centuryists might not have drawn from typically, you know, until this moment. And so I'm not just talking about BIPOC scholars within the field, because again, you know, one of the challenges of working in 18th century studies is that it's a, you know, overwhelmingly white field still in terms of practitioners. How do you change that? Well, you know, bring in contemporary, you know, like Black theory to think about the 18th century domestic novel, you know? I mean, that's really doable. And a lot of people have modeled that, or not a lot, but some people, I'm thinking in particular of, you know, Tricia Matthew, for example, have even modeled it for us. So to use the syllabus as a way of negotiating who is authorized to frame our approach to primary materials is a kind of important practice at this stage of whatever it is we're doing.
One quick, that's perverse, but quick kind of rounding up, and then we'll, as I said, we will document the questions that we weren't able to get to, but we're kind of trying to summarize. But some people have been asking about the undergraduate classroom. I think implicitly we've been, you know, particularly because of the relation that generated the kind of connections between you, Aisha, and Gina, we've been thinking about graduate education. What about, you know, the undergraduate, and how would one proceed, or is it different or not in how one knows from in the undergraduate classroom? And I think that'll be our last question.
Yeah. I think I should preface this by saying that I've done relatively little undergraduate teaching over the last few years. So most of my classroom experience has been with graduate students, while I've been thinking about these things explicitly in these terms. The undergraduate teaching that I have done, I teach one of our huge first year courses, which puts me in touch through lectures twice a week with a group of, I think the last time I taught it, it was, you know, just over 300 students enrolled in that class. So, you know, just like a huge group of undergraduates, but they break out into tutorials that are led by TAs for the one-on-one discussions. And so those are the frameworks in which I've been practicing, right, as an instructor. I would say quickly, one of the differences when teaching one of those large undergrad classes, and these are introduction to literature classes, right? They're not topics, they're not, you know, race, they're not race and gender in literature, it's just introduction to literature, how to do close reading. Again, I weave all of this stuff into my lectures. I focus on providing a vocabulary that introduces students as if it's basic, because it should be, right? Like I just proceed as if learning an anti-racist vocabulary is like literary studies 101, because as far as I'm concerned, it is. So it's all woven in there. But I recognize that in that kind of setup, people are free to tune in and tune out much more freely than in a graduate seminar. And so part of my approach has honestly been to go back to what Aisha said early on about who is your teaching for, right? Who is this pedagogy for? I would never say that I don't care about any of the students. I care about all the students in the classroom, and I'm trying to create a learning environment in which they are all able to learn from what I'm doing. But I'm willing to let the students who are unwilling to engage go, if that's how they're going to participate, right? I'm willing for them to, you know, not be the ones taking it in as fully or as meaningfully, if the students who are tuned into it, right, who want this and who need this, who are the ones who come up after class and say, no one has ever like said that before to me, or I never knew that you could study this, you know, at university. If those students are being given as full an opportunity as possible, I am really I'm centering them, right? I'm centering the students who are not accustomed to being centered by broad introductory level teaching. And that's just a choice that I have to make and commit to.
I've taught exclusively in undergraduate classrooms at the tutorial level. So usually I have about 20 students. And for me, one of the things that I try to offer to the undergraduate students is context. I try to offer them broad context so that they understand what we're talking about. So for example, we read a 19th century text called Blood of the Vampire, and it includes a lot of scientific racism. And so I provided them the context of scientific racism so that they could understand race as a category that was created, because I don't think that comes naturally. And when I do that, I likewise imagine myself as centering particular students in the room, even if there are very few of those students, because I want my students to understand and to learn an ethics of care in the tutorial space. And I center that from the very beginning. I center that in my syllabi, and I center that in each week of class. And if that means that participation is a little bit lower, I'm okay with that, because I would rather have students engage in less harm on the aggregate. So for me, I am always encouraging students to approach the texts with care, but also to approach one another with care. And for me, that means allowing people to make mistakes, but also allowing people to name the harms that they're experiencing if and when they need to. And I try not to assume that my students of color are coming into the class with specific knowledge. So obviously they have their lived experience, but I can't say how often going to a primarily white institution as an undergrad, I was presumed to have specific forms of knowledge, presumed to understand W.E.B. Du Bois like in a special way that my white peers didn't. And while I imagine that my understanding of double consciousness was perhaps a bit more intuitive, I didn't necessarily want them all staring at me for an answer. So I want people to understand both that whether they're coming to something for the first time or something has been part of their lives and unnamed for a very long time, we all have something to learn from that, and we all have a responsibility to one another in the room. And for me, that is part of anti-racist pedagogy, because I think the institution challenges us or compels us in some cases to hierarchize our students, or to imagine our students in competition with one another, or for our students to imagine themselves that way. And I want students to imagine themselves as caring for one another and as being part of a collective that's, as Gina said at the beginning, building knowledge. And I have the ability to do that in the tutorial classroom in a way that a lecture classroom might not. And I think I'm very fortunate in that I come to my teaching assistantship with some prior experience, but also with a strong understanding of the kind of anti-racist classroom I want to build. And so, but I'm always learning, obviously, and I think that we're all always learning. And I likewise try to be really upfront with my students about the ways that I'm learning and about how open I am to feedback from them. Because I think at the undergraduate level, students are much less willing to push back, even less so than at the graduate level. And if they're coming to school as first-gen students, BIPOC students, working class or poor students, all of those students are going to be a lot of those students come to the classroom less willing to engage with authority than their middle class or white peers. And so those are likewise things that I try to consider and build into my teaching so that it's easy for my students to approach me if they need to.
Wow, my mind is full, but so is my heart. And there's a phrase that you just spoke, Aisha, of a responsibility to one another. And I am so grateful to both of you and to all of us, everyone here to make this possible. This is just a tiny, tiny little beginning. And the work's ongoing. Please join me, everyone, in thanking Aisha and Gina. I know you can't see each other, but which is just so weird. We're gonna, we'll put this up. Let's talk on Twitter. Let's keep talking. But I am the ethics of care. Thank you, Aisha. All right.
Thank you so much, Tita, for having us, and Karen for facilitating, and Lee as well, and Aisha for conversing with me and continuing to.
Yes, thank you all. I really appreciated it. This was wonderful, and wonderful to be in conversation with Eugenia as always. But thank you, Tita, Karen, Lee, Danielle, and Liam for all of your hard work behind the scenes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.